As I said, I can usually reach into my briefcase and pull out a talk, maybe a little bit ragged at the corners, but not here. I'm not a historian of religion. I do have an academic connection to the subject, since in the sense that I've written a great deal about the American South. And you can't do that without encountering both the role of race and religion. And particularly if you grew up in the segregated South, as I did, you have to be aware that it is a region, as my old mentor, James McBride, said, haunted by God. In my case, I grew up in a rural Baptist church that was founded in 1776. I was baptized in the rather frigid waters of Lynch's River in March of 1952, something that will really test your faith. And I was confronted by issues of race again and again from the time that I was a child. The church I grew up in is on your right there, built in 1919. But the church on the left, I visited, it's a Bible church now, as it's called. And when I walked inside as a very young person, 15 or 16, I was struck by the fact that it had a balcony and seats around the balcony. And when I asked my friend, he said, "Oh, that was where the slaves sat." And to be sure, it was a church built in order to accommodate not only the white members, but Black members upstairs who were slaves. Still, if I'm willing to talk about this subject, and I'm quite aware that it is impossible to summarize the complex history of Christianity and race in 40 minutes. And so I've ruthlessly pruned my remarks. I won't be discussing the critical role of Black Christians during this period. I'll have little to say about Christianity and race outside the South, nor of the important role of Southern women in initially supporting but increasingly resisting white supremacy. Instead, it is a brief overview of white male evangelical Christians and race in the South, focusing on three critical periods. But before I begin to tell this story, I begin with two pictures. On the left is the most oft-printed portrait of Jesus of Nazareth ever created. Illustrator Warner Salmon first sketched this image in black and white and then painted his imagined portrait of Jesus in the 1920s. By one estimate, it has been reproduced over 1 billion times. On the right is the 2001 work of the British medical forensic sculptor Richard Neve, using a variety of sources, including the 2,000-year-old skull of a male in his 30s excavated from an area around ancient Galilee. This is the appearance of what Neve described as a typical male of the time and place. In Christian tradition, pictures of Jesus have often been created as a mirror, reflecting in a concrete way that since we're created in the image of the divine, we are more comfortable when we see the divine as a reflection of ourselves, or at least a romanticized version of ourselves. I don't think many people in Galilee had blue eyes in the first century. And so when we talk about whether religion shapes or simply reflects broader cultural ideas about race, it is, to say the least, a complicated issue. Religious convictions can change individuals' beliefs on many issues, including race. I know from people I knew from friendships with white Christians during the 1950s and 60s that their faith shaped their daily lives, often leading them to speak out courageously, asking of themselves and their fellow white Southerners what seems a cliche, but a relevant question: what would Jesus do? But faith can also reflect and justify whatever is comfortable to believe. and that certainly includes race. So I've undertaken this task. I hope you'll remember the sign posted in Western saloons. He's doing the best he can. Now, a bit of deep background. Most of these ideas were developed after 1830, that is the Christian pro-slavery argument, for the simple reason that there seemed little cause to explain the obvious. Slavery was a worldwide institution throughout the 18th century and much earlier. Although the founding fathers, many of them Southerners, created a new nation founded on freedom and wrestled with the conflict between slavery and freedom, little came of their concerns. And that wrestling, that concern about the conflict between slavery and freedom was far less important to Southerners a generation later. Two events created the need to justify slavery. The first was Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Southampton, Virginia. It resulted in the murder of 51 white men, women, and children by a Black religious leader and his followers. It terrified whites and placed them on the defensive. The second development was the rise of a growing anti-slavery movement, inspired by Northern evangelicals who saw slavery as a violation of the fundamental truths and values taught by Jesus of Nazareth. Now, because I am a biographer, I've decided to structure at least part of my remarks around a series of individuals, white males for the most part, who furnished the scaffolding for religious thinking on race among white Southerners, particularly in the years before the Civil War. First, Basil Manley and Robert Jones, two individuals who, for different reasons, I think illuminate what the pro-slavery defense was all about. Basil Manley was one of the most prolific and tireless Christian defenders of slavery. He was a wealthy planter, but so was Jones, who was a Georgia planter. In the case of Jones, he probably contributed less in terms of ideas about defending slavery, but he sought to create a living example of a benign and Christian slave community. More about him later. Manley was not unique among Southern Baptists and among Southern evangelicals and Christians. He had counterparts in the Southern branches of the other major Protestant denominations. William Capers, a Methodist. My first graduate paper was written about James Henley Thornwell, a Presbyterian who created the theological foundation for anti-slavery ideas. For pro-slavery ideas. Like his fellow defenders of slavery, Manley grounded his arguments with generous citations from the Bible, almost entirely from the Hebrew Bible. Manley's most systematic defense of slavery was encapsulated in his 8 Sermons on Duty, a series he preached at various venues across the South. In these sermons and in other writings, he placed the issue of slavery into a larger theological framework, the framework of the patriarchal family, which he saw as central to God's plan for human society. God had ordained differentiated roles for the family: the loving patriarch, the father, the obedient helpmeet, the wife, and the dependent and doubly obedient child. The practice of slavery should be understood within this context, said Manley. Thus, the divine order for accomplishing social needs naturally led to different occupations, some to labor, some to plan, some to direct the labor of others. Like a symbiotic ecosystem, men and women, parents and child, Black and white, had their roles to play. whites, of course, as superior, blacks as inferior. And when all parts functioned as designed, the society thrived and individual members, whatever their lot, were content since they were fulfilling God's created purpose. Now, the implications of this theology were clear to white Southerners that at all times, in all countries, whites have been naturally in a state of dominance, fulfilling their God-given role to direct the labor of inferiors. As the superior human species, whites were, in fact, in a very benevolent way, protecting blacks who were imported from Africa, rescuing them from savagery, cannibalism, idolatry, and in fact, enslaving them in a benevolent and Christian environment. In Manley's reading of history, the downfall of slave-owning societies came when masters did not heed their duties to treat their slaves well. Christianity, Manley argued, was the perfectly calibrated religion, and Southern American culture was the ideal setting to bring the natural system of slavery into godly balance. Operating in this harmonious way, Manley argued, both masters and slaves would come to see the mutual advantage and satisfaction that arises out of this relationship. Moreover, following these duties would put masters and slaves alike on the path to possessing in common the inheritance and dwelling place of heaven. In his sermons and writings and in debates, he held many debates with Northern abolitionists. Manley described this harmonious hierarchical system as vastly superior to the dog-eat-dog struggles of the Northern labor under unrestricted capitalism. He didn't use the word, but that's what he was talking about. Now, Manley spread this gospel of Christian white supremacy in his own pulpit, writing, and so forth. While he and other Southern church leaders worked to defend slavery, they were also laying the foundation for a division between North and South. As Northern evangelicals, a minority, but an important minority, accused white Southerners of participating in a system that violated the teachings of Jesus, Southern religious leaders led by Manley, who would become the chaplain of the Confederacy, they led Southerners into separation and separating from these Northern evangelicals and Christians who attacked their integrity and honor. In 1844, the Methodists divided North and South, the Baptists a year later, while Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Lutherans engaged in increasingly rancorous disputes over slavery. They only separated when the war began. Now, to return to Charles Colcott Jones. He's a fascinating figure. In the mid-1820s, he inherited 3 large plantations with over 150 slaves in Liberty County, Georgia. That was a rich cotton growing area only 15 miles from the Atlantic coast. As a seminary student at Princeton, where he studied for the ministry, he had toyed with the idea of gradual emancipation. He was clearly disturbed by the idea of slavery, but he concluded that this was impractical, not only for the actual problems of how do you, at that time, emancipate well over 1 million individuals, but also because he believed that blacks were not ready for freedom. Instead, he vowed to spend his life creating the kind of social harmony that pro-slavery Christian leaders and theologians had theoretically proposed. As a self-proclaimed missionary to the slaves, his idea, actually like that of Manley, but developed much more fully, was not to challenge social systems like slavery, but to transform individuals within the system of slavery and save their souls. And thus, if masters were to fulfill the role required by God, they must provide slaves with decent living conditions, a demonstrably fair and just system of discipline, the kind of thing that you would have for your children, a system that would preserve public order, above all, religious training that would elevate the moral sense of his slaves, or servants, as he preferred to call them. The final result would be a self-imposed moral control of their lives, much like Jones exercised over his own. At the same time, and this is clear from reading his letters, there was a very personal side to it. Jones desperately wanted to evoke from his slaves a sense of gratitude toward him, or at least satisfaction with their life in slavery. He hoped they could be made to see that their station in life was not important for determining their value as individuals. What was important was the quality of their Christian lives. Achieving a Christian stable life of moral order was satisfaction within itself. Thus, Jones spent years developing an oral catechism for non-literate slaves. And for the most part, he was an exemplary owner, allowing his slaves to grow their own garden, sell their own surplus at the marketplace. He furnished, by the standards of slavery, well-built cabins, food comparable to poor working class white women and men, and medical care. In fact, many of his neighbors felt he was spoiling his slaves. And then the war came. As Union soldiers seized several South Carolina and Georgia islands just off the Atlantic coast, one only 15 miles from one of his plantations, several of Jones' favorite slaves, individuals he liked to believe were members of his own family, slipped away during the night and went over to the northern side to gain their freedom. Seized by a sense of betrayal, he angrily turned on the men and women he had once called brothers and sisters in Christ. I thought they were content and happy and attached to our family, he wrote to his son. But in fleeing to the Yankees, they acted with duplicity. They acted with treachery. We have all been laboring under a delusion. That delusion, of course, was his belief and that of other slaveholders that physical security was more important to them than freedom. I usually don't promote other books other than my own, but if the story of Charles Jones interests you, there are two remarkable books. The National Book Award winning collection of letters, Children of Pride by Robert Manson Myers, my old colleague at Maryland, and Dwelling Place by church historian Erskine Clark. They're extraordinary, in particular the case of Erskine's book. It reads like a novel. It's a long novel, I should say that. Now, that sense of betrayal by whites turned to rage as they bitterly watched the rise of their former slaves, their chattel, to positions of power and prominence in the brief period of Reconstruction after the war from 1868 to a maximum of 1877. And that rage unleashed decades of violence. For the most part, white Southern leaders, religious leaders particularly, remained silent. At least prominent ones did. But in many cases, they endorsed violence as a regrettable necessity because of the need to control Blacks released from the wholesome discipline of slavery. Between 1865 and 1920, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 Black Southerners died at the hands of whites. The first burst of violence occurred during the Reconstruction era, when many of the white-on-black murders were designed to frighten and intimidate Blacks who sought political office or demanded their right to vote. After whites regained control of politics in the mid-1870s, segregation became the legal form of maintaining white supremacy, while lynching became the weapon that ensured absolute white control. And the rituals of Southern evangelicalism and its dogma of purity, literalism, and white supremacy shaped these decades of violence. As my student Amy Wood wrote in her book on lynching, Christianity was the primary lens through which most Southerners conceptualized and made sense of suffering and death of any sort. It would be inconceivable, she wrote, that whites could inflict pain and torment on the body and sometimes white women without imagining that violence was a religious act laden with Christian symbolism and significance. In their view, the God of the white South demanded racial purity, a purity embodied by the white woman on her pedestal. To protect her virtue and the larger society, mob lynching was the way they could affirm their freedom from the moral contamination represented by Blacks and Black men in particular. Even though more than 70% of the victims of lynch mobs were not even accused of sexual crimes, their perceived threat was defined by the myth of the Black rapist, a demon, a beast who set out to defile the Christian purity of white Southern womanhood. Many defenders of lynching, in fact, I suspect most, understood their acts as a Christian duty, consecrated as God's will against racial transgression. These events were not outlaw actions carried on under the cover of darkness. They often involved hundreds, even thousands of individuals. It was a communal rite that took place openly within the context of a sacred order designed to sustain holiness. The sacred order was white supremacy, and holiness was white virtue. And here I would emphasize that repeatedly ministers were there to give it sanction and approve it. Now, this may seem a little reaching too far, but I want to make just a brief discussion about evangelical Christianity outside the South. Now, there was not, because there weren't that many Blacks, it wasn't a problem. You don't have the same kind of violence, the obsession to maintain white supremacy, although there were prejudice. But in some ways, a kind of parallel development took place in Protestant Christianity during the late 19th century, the so-called Gilded Age. As the anti-slavery movement and other evangelical reform movements declined, and they did in the 1870s and 80s, increasingly within Protestant Christianity, the focus was on personal piety and salvation. As the most distinguished historians of, one of the most distinguished historians of American religion wrote, this concentration upon the individual center led inexorably to a preoccupation with personal sins, fornication outside marriage, adultery, lying, drunkenness, blasphemy, gossiping, even smoking occasionally. Now, that was the general trend, but outside the South, a modest shift did take place in American Protestantism in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In part, it was driven by concern over the wretched conditions of working Americans during the Gilded Age. And no individual better marked this shift than Walter Rauschenbusch, who shaped a new theology he called the social gospel. In 1885, Rauschenbusch became pastor of the Second Baptist Church in New York City, located in Hell's Kitchen, a 19th century slum dominated by poverty, malnutrition, disease, and crime. Oh, the children's funerals. They grip my heart, he wrote his parents in 1888. This is one of the things I always went away thinking about. Why did these children have to die? And he realized that much of it was rooted in the wretched living conditions in which they lived. He immersed himself in the literature of social reform, very much influenced by a number of Europeans, and began to participate in social action groups. Soon, this handsome and eloquent young minister was called to the American Baptist's most prestigious school for training ministers, Rochester Seminary. There, he was at times something of a scandal. One of the most oft-quoted phrases by Rauschenbusch certainly shocked many of his evangelical contemporaries. The kingdom of God is not a matter of simply getting individuals to heaven, he wrote, but of transforming life on earth to the harmony of heaven. And he warned that the excessive individualism and obsession with personal salvation removed from the Bible its rich resources for addressing and responding to the structural sins that made life miserable for all God's children. An effective witness for the message of Christ, he argued, was impossible so long as Christianity remained private and personal. Some years later, there was some impact of the social gospel movement in the Methodist Church women's movement in the 1920s and 1930s. But by and large, the social gospel movement had little impact in the South, beyond perhaps strengthening the obsession with doing away with demon rum. Evangelical Protestantism in the region continued to be, as Rauschenbusch had said, essentially private and personal. Now, beginning in the early 1950s, the rise of the civil rights movement and the challenge to segregation, once again, as in the time before the Civil War, placed the white South, the white Christian South, on the defense. There was, however, one striking difference between the segregationists of the mid-20th century and the pro-slavery ideologues of the mid-19th century. As I've indicated, the leading Southern churchmen during the era of slavery were also the leading defenders of slavery. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was widespread support for segregation among white evangelical Southerners, and a few prominent ministers in the South did, in fact, create a defense of segregation and white supremacy based upon a kind of tortured exegesis of virtues from the Bible. In 1956, W.A. Criswell, who was the pastor of the Dallas First Baptist Church, then the largest in the South, still the largest in the South, I think about 4,000 or 5,000 members. He attacked in a sermon, which was widely reprinted, the foolishness and idiocy of government-forced integration. He had particularly harsh words for Southern religious proponents of equality of races. Let them integrate, he said. Let them sit up there in their dirty shirts and make all their fine speeches. But they're all a bunch of infidels dying from the neck up. Well into the 1960s, he was giving sermons invoking the old Hamite myth in which Africans and their descendants in America inherited God's curse that they should be a servant people. Now, a number of others joined with him, but not really that many. Perhaps the last public stand for the old-time racism came when Bob Jones delivered a radio address in 1960, defending segregation as part of God's plan and integration, the work of Satan. It was met with embarrassed silence by the overwhelming majority of church leaders. evangelical, and mainline. And here is the point I would like to emphasize. The collapse of traditionally racist arguments among respectable religious conservatives actually proved liberating for them, for it allowed Southern evangelicals, particularly Southern Baptists, and the thousands of independent megachurches and independent churches to develop a new kind of theology that was much more acceptable and congenial to non-Southerners, non-Southern conservative religious people as well. Like Criswell and Bob Jones, many of these individuals raised the frightening threat of godless communism and its links with the civil rights movement. You didn't have to use a racial argument. You simply had to show that the civil rights movement was tied to the Communist Party or that it was carrying out the wishes of the Communist Party. I should say that Billy Graham, while he always rejected racist arguments, embraced some of the most extreme anti-communist rhetoric of his day. And so television and radio outlets gave a extraordinary influence in the last half of the 20th century. Next slide there. There you go. To these arguments. Now, some of you may be old enough to remember these people. Many of you probably don't. This is my field. I do. There was Dr. Fred Schwartz, who was Australian born, who set up the first great anti-communist Christian crusades in the 1950s, followed by the Reverend Carl McIntyre, a Presbyterian minister, Billy James Hargis, who was an independent televangelist, one of the first of the televangelists. These individuals initially worked through radio, and by the middle and end of the 1970s, were being broadcast on hundreds of radio and television networks, all the time directly drawing a link between the growing activism of civil rights and the government support of civil rights as examples of the infiltration of godless communism into every corner of our societies. Now, these individuals reached enormous audiences. And what is striking when you go back and look at the time is how it was largely ignored by the mainstream media. The fake media. Now, these were simply the first wave of televangelists. Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Baker, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Joel Osteen, who's still active. Some were simply shysters touting a prosperity gospel, more interested in raking in cash from viewers to allow themselves to live the lifestyle of the rich and the famous. Others were drawn to right-wing politics, where they saw the possibility of using government power to turn back what they believed to be the godlessness of modern liberalism. And they had an audience that welcomed them into their homes, driven by many factors: the decline of male patriarchy, the unsettling changes in the way in which we viewed and acted upon public sexuality, the general rise of secularism, and in more recent times, the influx of foreigners of different faiths that threatened to undermine their view that America was a white Christian nation, at best, a white Judeo-Christian nation. Now, between 1970 and 2000, the success of this new wave of conservative evangelicals, Christians, and particularly not just in the South, but throughout the nation, was reflected not only in their rise, but in the sharp decline in the largest mainline Christian churches that, at least at the leadership level, tended to accept and in some cases to embrace many of these changes. Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, American Baptists, United Church of Christ, all shrank in membership, some of them dramatically. Meanwhile, as I said, there was a steady rise in more theologically and politically conservative evangelical churches, Southern churches, Southern Baptist, independent Bible congregations, and various conservative offshoots of the mainline denominations. Leading the way has been the growth of evangelical megachurches. I found a report listing the number of such churches, and I was stunned. There are over 1,000 with membership from 5,000 to 100,000 in the United States. We shouldn't overlook the overall decline in church membership, which began in the late 1990s at the end of this rise in evangelical membership. Because what happened between 2000 and 2018 was that the overall decline in church membership was from 69% of all Americans in 2000 to 50% in 2018. At the same time, the number of Americans who claimed no religious affiliation increased from 10% to 23%. Now, this is a story I think is connected to the one I'm talking about, but it's another story. However, these changes in the Christian church, particularly among denominations in the region, but nationwide as well, however they might be described, it's clear that we're a long way from both the old-time religion of white supremacy, but even further from the vision of the beloved community as expressed by Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and many others who fought for racial justice. Perhaps we should be grateful for the fact that some religious leaders who were once silent have now expressed regret for the history of white supremacy. In 1995, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a formal apology for its role in supporting slavery and segregation. Perhaps but last November, the presidents of all 6 Southern Baptist seminaries issued a statement attacking the development of critical race theory, a way of looking at the role of institutional racism in American life. These 6 white presidents insisted that the only way to view prejudice was through the scriptural concept of individual sin, that emphasizing race or gender or sexuality was unscriptural. So here we are again to the original challenge laid down by Walter Rauschenbusch, that a religion that was private and personal distorted the message of Jesus and ignored the underlying problems of a society gripped by injustice. It's enough to make one more than a little cynical about the role of religion in confronting the great challenges of racial division and disparities in American life. For every step forward, we seem to be taking a half step backwards. Still, I keep remembering it is a different world from the one where I grew up. And I do take heart from those dissidents in the past who were driven by an authentic religious faith founded upon the Hebrew prophets and the teachings of Jesus. There are so many, many of whom are now forgotten. But one of the figures, and I choose only one here, is someone that many of you as Lutherans know, Robert Gratz, who died last September. Robert Gratz was an extraordinary individual. And next. In the spring of 1955, a Black Lutheran church in Montgomery, Alabama, found itself unable to hire a minister because of the shortage of Lutheran African-American ministers. Bob Gratz, 27 years old and ordained, agreed to accept their call. Over the next 3 years, as he threw himself not only into the growth of the church, but into the struggle for civil rights, he became an integral part of the leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. During that time, Local whites slashed his car tires, poured sugar in his gas, threw rocks through his front windows on 4 occasions, and far worse, with the death threats and 2 bombings of his home. Generally treated as a pariah by most of the white community, he and his wife survived with a kind of gallows humor. His wife, Jeannie, once said that the Klan was particularly, Jeannie, I'm sorry, once said that the Klan was particularly enraged over their integrated swimming pool, which was a tarp laid over an oversized tractor tire and filled with water where children and the children of black neighbors could play in the summer heat. That was the swimming pool that they had put up that caused such outrage. Years later, when asked how he and his wife endured such a nightmare, he seemed taken aback. Of course, we were sometimes afraid, he told the interviewer, but these were the most satisfying years of our lives. In joining the struggle, our lives were enriched far more than anything we did for our black brothers and sisters. As Jeannie Gratz said, it never occurred to us to be intimidated by just how difficult it would be to bring about an end to the system that surrounded it. We just acted, she said. As I read her remarks, I remembered an essay by Joanna Macy. Macy is an environmental activist and author of more than a dozen books on Buddhism. And in the 1980s, she visited a group of Tibetan monks and nuns whose 1,000-year-old monastery had been destroyed by the Chinese government. Working with nothing more than hand tools and wheelbarrows, they began rebuilding this huge monastery. To Macy, their reconstruction with such limited resources seemed overwhelming. What if the Chinese troops should simply return once again with their bulldozers, she asked one monk. He shrugged. Macy saw that such calculations were conjecture to the men and women who worked. Since you cannot see into the future, she wrote, you simply proceed to put one stone on top of another and another on top of that. And if the stones get knocked down, you begin again. Because if you don't, nothing will get built. Like the monks and nuns of Larangar, we cannot foresee the future any more than we can change the past. But all of us, whatever our particular religious faith or no specific faith, we all have an obligation to speak and above all to act in this moment of crisis in our national life. So that's the choice before us. If the stones get knocked down, like the monks and nuns of Larangar, we have to begin again. Because if we don't, nothing will get built. Thank you very much.